What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards, old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. As well as our second channel sponsor, the Hobby Horse in Taylorville, Illinois. If you're ever in town, be sure to stop in and say hi to Martin. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we're bringing you another fun game where apparently everyone decided they needed to play a deck that included some kind of red. This week's matchup featured Eric playing his Niv-Mizzet Parun deck, Ryan playing everybody's favorite CDH Voltron commander, Slicer Hired Muscle, Fogral playing his all-time favorite deck, Marath Will of the Wild, and Patrick playing his mono-red deck being led by Purphoros God of the Forge. Now that we're fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Fog plays a tapped Jungle Shrine, while Patrick plays a Mountain and casts a Turn 1 Soul Ring. Eric pays 2 life to bring in an untapped Steam Vents before paying to suspend an Ancestral Vision. Ryan plays his own Mountain and then pays 1 for a Commander's Plate. Fog plays a Plants for turn and then pays 2 to cast a Gyre Sage, while Patrick plays another Mountain for turn and casts his commander, Purphoros. Eric removes a time counter from his vision before drawing for turn and playing an island. He then pays 2 for an Izzet Signet and passes his turn. Ryan plays a Tirade Sanctum for turn before paying 2 for a Dampening Sphere. Fog plays a Mountain for turn and then taps out to cast his commander Marath, who enters with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. He then adds a counter to his Gyre Sage and passes turn. Patrick draws and then casts a Goblin Rabblemaster, which deals 2 damage to each of his opponents. He then goes to combat, creating a Goblin token which deals another 2 damage to each of his opponents, before he then swings his Goblin token at Ryan for 1 damage. Eric removes another counter from his vision and draws for turn. He then plays a Cavern of Souls for turn, naming dragons, before he then pays 3 for an Ensnaring Bridge. Ryan plays a Proxy Chrome Mox before paying to cast a vehicle side of his commander, Slicer. He then goes to combat, swing his commander Eric for 3 commander damage, before he then transforms Slicer and gives it to Fog on his upkeep. Fog draws for turn and then taps his Sage to help him cast an Urban Daggertooth. He then puts another counter on his Sage before the table realizes Ryan should not have been able to cast his commander, so he rewinds his turn, which has him taking away Eric's commander damage while he puts Slicer back in his command zone. Patrick draws and then casts a Hellrider, which deals 2 damage to each of his opponents. He then goes to combat, creating another Goblin token dealing 2 damage to each of his opponents, before swinging both of his Goblin tokens at Fog, which has him taking 2 damage off the Hellrider trigger. Fog then blocks with his Daggertooth and his commander, which then has him proliferating the counters off the Daggertooth's ability. Eric removes another counter off his vision, then draws for turn. He then pays to cast Baral, Chief of Compliance, before paying 3 life to bring in an untapped Seagate Reborn. He then pays another 2 to cast a Mercurial Spelldancer and passes. Ryan draws for turn and then actually has the appropriate mana to cast his commander Slicer. On his end step, Fog pays to use Marath's ability to remove a counter and ping his Daggertooth, which then proliferates the counters on his commander and his Sage before he starts his turn. Fog then draws and then pays to cast Cut a Deal, which has each of his opponents draw a card while he draws 3 cards. He then plays a Forest as his land for turn before casting a Kami of Whispered Hopes. Patrick draws and then plays a Mountain for turn before paying to cast Squee the Immortal, which deals 2 damage to each of his opponents. He then casts a Dragon Master Outcast, dealing another 2 damage to each of his opponents. He then creates a Goblin token, which has him dealing 2 more damage to his opponents before he goes to combat, swinging his token at Fog. Fog then takes the 1 damage off the Hellrider and blocks with his Daggertooth, which then has him proliferating the counters on each of his creatures. Eric removes the last suspension counter off his Ancestral Vision, which has him drawing 3 cards before he draws his card for turn. He then plays a Strip Mine for turn before going to combat, swinging his Mercurial Spelldancer Patrick for 2 damage. Ryan draws for turn and then pays to equip his commander with his commander's plate. And on his end step, Fog once again pays to ping his Daggertooth with Marath's ability in order to proliferate the counters on both of his creatures. Fog then draws for turn and casts a Kadama's Reach, and then shortcuts his turn by also casting a Rampant Growth. This then has him going into his library to get a Forest and a Mountain to put into play, while he gets a Plains to put in his hand, but he then plays as his land for turn. Fog then pays to cast a Victory Chimes, which has Eric responding by pitching a Fierce Guardianship in order to counter the spell with a Force of Negation. Patrick draws and plays a Mirror March for turn before going to combat and creating a Goblin token, dealing 2 damage to each of his opponents. He then goes to combat, once again swinging at Fog, dealing 1 damage to him while Fog blocks with his Daggertooth and proliferates the counters on both of his creatures. Eric then starts his turn while we realize Squee also should have attacked, so he swings him at Fog, who takes the damage and blocks with his commander. Eric plays a Beseju for turn before going to combat, swinging his Spelldancer Patrick, once again dealing 2 damage. He then pays in order to cast a Time Spiral and removes the counters from his Spell Dancer in order to copy it. We then all have to go through the process of shuffling our hands and graveyards into our libraries and drawing 7 cards 2 times. In between draws, Eric untaps 6 lands to float his mana before untapping them again a second time. Eric then casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift, bouncing all the permanents back to his opponent's hands, before he then pays 1 to cast a Gamble. This then has him going into his library to search up a card to put into his hand, before Ryan rolls to have him randomly discard the card that he tutored for. Eric then pays 1 for Sensei's Divining Top and passes turn. Ryan plays a Mountain for turn before casting a Jeweled Lotus. He then recasts his Proxy Chrome Mox, exiling his commander back to his command zone. He then cracks a Lotus in order to help pay to recast his commander a second time, and in response, Eric uses his top to look at the top 3 cards of his library. Eric then puts the cards back on top of his library where Ryan casts a Sword of Forge and Frontier. Ryan then goes to combat, swinging Slicer at Patrick this time for 3 commander damage, and then transforms him, giving him to Fog on his upkeep. Fog plays a Force for turn and then recasts his Gyre Sage. He then pays to cast Mina and Den Wildborn, putting a counter on his Sage. He then plays a second land for turn and then recasts Marath, who enters with 3+1/+1 counters. This then adds a second counter to his Sage and he goes to combat. Fog then swings Slicer Eric, who blocks with Baral, before he then ends his turn and Ryan gives Patrick Slicer on his upkeep. Patrick then pays to recast his Soul Ring before tapping out to cast Purphoros. He then swings Slicer Eric, who just takes the 6 commander damage and then gets Slicer on his upkeep. Eric draws for turn and then goes to combat, swinging Slicer back at Patrick, who's forced to take the 6 commander damage. Eric then casts a Shattering Spree, replicated once in order to destroy Slicer and Ryan's Chrome Mox. He then pays to use his top once again, looking at the top 3 cards of his library and putting it back in any order, before using his top to draw a card. He then pays 1 to cast his own Soul Ring and passes turn. Ryan plays the Crystal Veins for turn and then tries to cast a Brotherhood's End, which once again gets countered by Eric with a Force of Negation. Ryan then pays 1 to recast the Commander's Plate and passes. Fog plays the Plains for turn before then paying to recast his Kami of Whispered Hopes and his Urban Daggertooth. This then adds 2 more counters to his Sage, which he then taps to help cast a Wilderness Reclamation. Fog then pays to cast a Sakura Tribe Elder before going to his end step and untapping all of his lands, while Patrick also untaps and draws for turn. Patrick plays a Mountain for turn before casting a Sulfuric Vortex, and then recasting his Dragon Master Outcast, dealing 2 damage to each of his opponents. Eric takes 2 damage on his upkeep, while Fog pays to put a counter on his Kami of Whispered Hopes. Eric then swings a Spell Dancer at Patrick once again, before casting a Chaos Warp and copying it with a Spell Dancer, targeting both of his mana rocks. He then shuffles both of his cards back into his library before revealing his 2 top cards, which are an Arcane Denial and an Island. He then puts the Island into play before putting the Arcane Denial back on top of his library, and then pays 1 to cast his Sensei's Divining Top. He then pays the top again, looking at his top 3 cards before passing his turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and then casts a Lockstone Warhammer, and then tries to cast a Dampening Sphere, which has Eric responding by using his top to draw his top card of his library and countering it with an Arcane Denial. On his end step, Fog uses Marath's ability to remove a counter and add a +1/+1 counter back to Marath, doubling each time he does it. He then also sacks his Steve to go get a Mountain to put in a play from his library before he then draws for turn. Fog then pays to cast a Frilled Death Spitter before ending his turn, untapping all of his lands. Patrick untaps and draws for turn before he then plays another Mountain. He then recasts his Goblin Rabblemaster, which deals 2 damage to each of his opponents. Patrick then goes to combat, creating another Goblin token, dealing another 2 damage to each of his opponents. He then goes to his second main phase, which has him paying to Chaos Warp his Goblin token. He then shuffles his library and reveals a CGN Commander off the top. With the CGN Commander ETB on the stack, Fog responds by demonstrating a loop where he can remove and add enough counters to and from Marath and his Frilled Raptor to ping his Raptor and deal 2 damage enough times to take out each of his opponents, winning the game. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe in order to see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.